Sounds True presents Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything, or Old Bob Exposes His Ignorance. Session 4, Politics and Conspiracy Theory.
You fearlessly adopted some of the most bizarre positions on almost every topic. So
I have?
Well,
see, I thought all my positions were perfect common sense and the rest of the world was weird.
Be that as it may, how have you settled on libertarianism as being closest to something that is meaningful for you?
Well, I will quote three American presidents, the first three. George Washington said, "Government is not reason, it is not persuasion, it is force. Like fire, it is a treacherous servant and a dangerous master." And I think any contemplation of political history will show that government seldom remains a treacherous servant. It very rapidly becomes a dangerous master. John Adams said, "Power, wherever invested, whether in a single monarch, an oligarchy, or the majority of a democratic parliament, is always despotic, arbitrary, diabolical, and in every respect dangerous." He was the second president. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, said, "The best government is the least government." So you see, there's nothing really radical or original about my thinking. I got the first three presidents on my side.
So if these aphorisms are true, then why not anarchy?
Why not indeed? Henry David Thoreau pointed out, when Jefferson said the best government is the least government, the logical deduction is the least government is no government at all, so why don't we try that? Jefferson had similar sentiments at least once. In one of his letters, he wrote, "If the democratic experiment fails," I'm paraphrasing, of course, my memory isn't letter perfect. "If the democratic experiment fails, I don't think we should move in the direction of European monarchism. We should rather see how well we can adopt the anarchism of our native Indian population." So Jefferson was not too hostile to anarchy. Ralph Waldo Emerson pointed out that during the Revolutionary War, Massachusetts was in anarchy. There was no government at all. And yet everybody was acting cooperatively and friendly and neighborly fashion to kill as many Englishmen as they could. But it was a total anarchy. There was no government at all. And yet people weren't robbing one another's houses, or raping one another's women, or anything like that. No, I got Emerson on my side, too. My God, then there's Friedrich Nietzsche. The state, everything it has stolen. It even bites with stolen teeth.
Can you explain the term SOG?
SOG stands for Tsarist Occupation Government, which is what we've got now. They're in charge of the piss police and all sorts of other spies, snoops, and informers. Well, no European can believe it. The only thing you can compare to the United States today is the world you find in the great Russian novels of the 19th century under the last czars. The voters of California, in their wisdom and charity, a couple of years ago voted to legalize marijuana for medical use in a variety of specified cases, including cancer, AIDS, muscular sclerosis, post-polio syndrome, and two or three others. And this came about because of the initiative process, which was introduced at the end of the 19th century, when a lot of pretty smart people began to realize that the federal government was no longer representing the people, it was representing the millionaire class only. And as an attempt to make the system more democratic, the initiative was introduced. It was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court repeatedly. And through the initiative process, the people can pass their own laws and counteract the influence that big money has on politicians. So we got this wonderful initiative process that looked like it was going to restore democracy. Then we passed an initiative that the SOG didn't like, the Tsarist Occupation Government in Washington. So what did they do? Clinton comes on television and announces, "Fuck you, you can't make your own laws. We make the laws, you just obey them." And the whole initiative process has been completely abolished after 100 years of making steps. And most of the states that have the initiative, really progressive changes have come about through the initiative. Now the initiative doesn't mean anything anymore. The president can just cancel it and appoint a czar to make sure we got to obey the czarist rules and we can't make our own laws anymore. power ever vested is to be diabolical and in every respect dangerous, to quote John Adams, or it is a fearful master, to quote George Washington again. Peter McWilliams, who died recently because they took away his pot, he was a cancer and AIDS patient who, due to chemotherapy, spent most of his time vomiting until he discovered that marijuana controlled the vomiting. And under Proposition 215, the initiative passed by the voters of California, he had a legal right to the marijuana. So he started growing marijuana plants in his yard, and he was growing quite a few of them because he wanted to distribute it to other sufferers from those diseases. And he also wanted to find which strains were best for which purposes, which are best for controlling nausea, which was his problem, which are best for controlling pain, which is the problem with a lot of people, with muscular sclerosis and post-polio, etc. They busted him, and the judge forbade Pete Williams' lawyer to say in court that the voters of California had voted to give him the right to use marijuana to treat his illness. They couldn't even mention that to the jury. If the jury didn't know it, they didn't find it out in the courtroom. That was not considered a legitimate defense. The people have no rights anymore. The SOG decides for us. We just obey. The judge had to meditate a long time on the sentence because Peter was going to die in a year or two anyway, so any sentence would amount to a death sentence. But judges have to do things according to the rules. We had to read parole reports and all sorts of reports, this and that, and meditate deeply on how many years he was going to give this guy in prison, in a prison hospital, and in 1 or 2 years he had left of life. And during that time, while the judge was meditating, he forbade Peter to use the marijuana anymore to control the nausea. So Peter went back to vomiting all day long in the bathroom, and he finally choked on his own vomit and died. And when I tell people we got a Tsarist government, they look at me like I'm a little bit peculiar. All they got to do is read a novel by Dostoevsky or Turgenev, and they'll see the government we've got right now is the government the Russians had in the 19th century.
Well, what about, like, for example, the fact that our government is elected and the czars were never elected? It seems like a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it sure does, until you look at the matter a little more closely. Jim Hightower, who was a Democratic politician until a few years ago, now he's in the Green Party. He has published a list of about 30 corporations that have each donated $500,000 to both Gore and Bush. So both Gore and Bush owe about $30 million to big corporations before they get elected. This is to finance their campaigns. It costs well over $100 million to run a campaign for president now. I don't know how much. It was $100 million in the 80s. By now it's probably up to $300 million. Anyway, a large part of this comes from all the major corporations. So whichever one of them gets elected, they're in the bag to these big corporations already. They wouldn't even get to the convention if they didn't have that money from those big corporations. So what we got is what the Honorable Senator Pettigrew said when he resigned from the Senate in 1898, a government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. And Lincoln's dream of a government of the people, by the people, for the, is a noble dream, and I'd love to see it realized, but we don't have anything remotely like that. When the people can't even make their own laws through the initiative process anymore, the last straw of democracy has been destroyed.
Now, you say the ideals have been lost, or the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. Do you think that freedom in America compares unfavorably to, say, freedom 40 or 50 years ago?
Oh, very definitely. 40 or 50 years ago, even at the height of the McCarthy era, I think if Joe McCarthy got on television and said, I have a urine test for communism and I want everybody to give urine samples where they work so we can find the communists, that would have been the end of his career. The idea of forcing Americans to empty the contents of their bladder to government inspectors. Even Kafka never came up with a satire on totalitarianism as absurd as that. Now the American people have been so conditioned to Tsarist-type government for so long that, yeah, sure, we'll give you a urine sample. You want a hair sample? Do you want a blood sample? You want my fingerprints? Somebody wrote a book with this title, A Nation of Sheep. They'll accept any crap the government hands them. And if you quote the Constitution at them, they think you're a red. Or worse.
You've been involved in the civil rights movement since at least the early 60s. Can you talk about what that was like and what you're continuing to do today?
I was the only time I ever got busted. After a life of subversive activities and thought crime and heresy of all sorts. I got busted for trespassing in a barber shop.
How did that occur?
Well, we were trying to persuade the barber to desegregate, and he didn't want to desegregate, and so we had a series of sit-ins, and I got busted in one of the sit-ins.
This was Ohio?
Yeah, Yellow Springs, Ohio. It's a very interesting feeling when you're under arrest. It's just like when you get drafted, you suddenly realize your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the government. They can do anything they want with you now that you're under arrest. As a matter of fact, if one of them wanted to pull out a gun and shoot me, probably three of the others would swear in court that I was resisting arrest. Happens all the time, a regular practice. It's a really creepy feeling. I think I was a philosophical anarchist before I was arrested, and after I was arrested, I was an emotional anarchist.
What do you perceive as the greatest threat to our freedom?
The stupidity of the population. As Schiller said, against stupidity the gods themselves contend in vain.
Do you feel that the American population is more stupid in some way than any other population, or?
Well, in lots of ways. In Europe, the owners, the capitalists, the entrepreneurs, the managers, they all believe the more intelligent the workers, the better their work will be. So they believe in giving good educations even to the working class. In this country, the capitalists seem to believe the stupider the population is, the easier it is to manipulate them. So why waste time by trying to educate them? And there's been a deliberate dumbing down since the 60s. I was every decade I see more college graduates who don't seem to know. They not only don't know anything, they don't even suspect anything. Fortunately, internet is working in the opposite direction.
I wanted to ask you about that. You know, many people claim that technology is going to, you know, especially the internet and computers, are going to be used to enslave us in some horrible way. And you hear an equal number of people arguing just the opposite, that it's bringing about all these new types of freedom or new vistas of freedom. How do you feel about that?
Well, to take it by a curious path, when I was working on my historical novels, my wife used to collect old encyclopedias. Every time she was in a bookstore that had a set of old encyclopedias, she'd buy it. So we had about 8 different sets of encyclopedias in the house. So every time I wanted to look up a historical detail, I'd look it up in 3 or 4 of the encyclopedias, and always it didn't take as much as 3. Usually only 2 I'd find a disagreement. If I went through all 8 encyclopedias, I'd find 8 different. Like how old was Mozart when he wrote his first symphony? He was either 7 or 8, depending on which encyclopedia you look in. How tall was the Bastille? 90 feet, 100 feet, or 120 feet, according to 3 encyclopedias I consulted. This is what provoked me to what I call Wilson's 22nd law. Certitude belongs exclusively to those who only own 1 encyclopedia. If you own more than 1, you begin to encounter a certain amount of doubt and uncertainty about things in general. More and more people are doing research on internet. I wrote an article a few months ago in which I didn't open a single book. All the research I had to do, I did on the web, on the world. Everything I wanted was on the World Wide Web. That certainly wasn't true 10 years ago when I first got online. I did a whole article without once leaving the computer. Everything I wanted to look up, I just go to the World Wide Web and I could find it pretty fast. So more and more people are doing research on the web. And the one thing you find out when you do research on the web is what you find out if you own 8 encyclopedias, which is that there's no one reliable source. There are a dozen different sources all claiming to be reliable. And then you've got to use your own ingenious mind and your own talent for analysis and skepticism to try to figure out which one of these guys really sounds like he might know what he's talking about, or which one should I bet on. Husserl says every active perception should be regarded as a gamble. And from the experiments I've done and the experiments I've led in my workshops and seminars, that has become overwhelmingly obvious and true to me. Every perception is a gamble. Just think you're walking down the street in a big city. You see a face half a block away. If you think it's a friend of yours, you get a little closer, it's a total stranger. All perception operates on gambles. You pick up a few details, you fill in the rest. And if the guy never comes any closer, you're not sure whether you saw an old friend or somebody who just looked a little bit like an old friend.
How does that relate directly to our political freedom, though?
The main trouble with Marxist parties is they think that Das Kapital has all the answers in it. The major problem with the United States is that about 50% of the population at least thinks the Bible has all the answers in it. And then there are libertarians who think Ludwig von Mises has all the answers, except for the ones who think Ayn Rand has all the answers. If you think there's one book that has the answers, you're never going to really discover anything, and you're never going to think an original thought. If you find out there's 12 books with different answers, you're almost forced to start thinking. So I feel Internet is forcing more and more people to do something they've never done in their lives before, which is try to make an independent judgment, how to judge between alternatives.
We've mainly been talking about American politics. What about world politics right now? How do you see that going?
Well, I think the East-West conflict is being replaced by a North-South conflict. I think more and more the darker parts of the globe are struggling to become more independent of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the whole complex that Bucky Fuller calls MMAO, Machiavelli, Mafia, Atoms, and Oil. As a matter of fact, Michio Kaku, the physicist, he said he quit working for the government when he discovered that most of the Star Wars technology was aimed at third world countries and not at the Soviet Union at all. That the United States already figured they had the Soviet Union buffalo even before the Cold War ended. And they were getting ready for wars with the Southern Hemisphere, which would be in purely imperialistic wars, although of course the mass media will never admit it. It'll always be a war for freedom and God and the American way and apple pie and good old mom. But basically they're all wars to maintain the power of the major corporations and banks.
So the story of the 20th century continues.
Yeah, but as Asia and Africa come online, I see a global brain forming. I didn't invent that metaphor. It's been used by quite a few people. I think as information travels faster and faster and more and more directions, that we're going to develop a global system, not necessarily a world government, but some kind of world governance, let's say, a confederation of some sort, where everybody will be fairly equally represented. I know it sounds utopian, but hell, the Constitution sounded utopian, and it worked for a while. I think the European and Canadian and most of the civilized world, I think most of them have gone a long way down the path I think we have to go in order to have a peaceful and prosperous planet. I think you find more of the United States Constitution alive in Europe and Canada than you do in the United States right now. But I think the United States will eventually rediscover the Constitution. It does exist. You can find it in the back of the dictionary. The Tsar hasn't ordered it taken out of the dictionaries yet. Well, that might be the next step. I would say the Scandinavian countries please me more than any others on the planet right now. And France and Germany are moving more and more on that. So even Portugal is moving in that direction. Hell, they legalized abortion in Spain. I think they just legalized marijuana in Portugal. The world is moving toward a saner system, but I think the United States will be the last one to move because the power groups here are so entrenched and so committed to a very reactionary philosophy.
But do you think that the United States as the center, more or less, of the Internet will reap any of those benefits before other countries?
Oh yeah, to some extent. I think the growing skepticism about the government, which, as I pointed out in my book, Everything is Under Control, around 75% of the population doesn't trust the government anymore. I used to feel like a lone eccentric in distrusting the government. Now it turns out I'm part of the majority. 75% of the population doesn't trust the government. I think that's chiefly due to Internet. Because on the Internet you get hundreds of different viewpoints, whereas in the corporate media you only get one viewpoint. Or you cover the whole spectrum, as Noam Chomsky likes to say. They give you the whole spectrum from far right to middle of the road, so you feel you're getting a variety. That's the newspapers. TV doesn't even go that far. They only give you one viewpoint, the far right.
Yeah, I noticed that particular statistic that It's a 1996 survey showing 3 out of 4 Americans believe the government is basically constantly involved in nefarious activities and conspiracies. You think the internet has caused this change?
Well, yeah, mostly, I think, yeah. I mean, the most outrageous charges against the government can be found on internet. They seldom get into the major media. There was a reporter on the San Jose Mercury News who did a series of articles on the CIA's involvement in the cocaine business, about which there's been at least a dozen books already. And a week later, the San Jose Mercury News printed an editorial saying the stories were inaccurate, and they fired him. He has since written another book about the subject, adding to the vastly growing library about the CIA and cocaine, and he goes around lecturing about it. And I've read a lot of these books. If I was on the jury, I'd vote guilty if the CIA were on trial as a major coke dealer. But you can't get it into the major media.
So this is an example of a conspiracy theory that is still up in the air in terms of the verdict, but you actually believe it to be real and true.
Like I said, if I were on the jury, I'd vote guilty, knowing what I know now. Of course, if I were on the jury, I'd have to listen to the case for the defense, too, and I might change my mind.
Still, conspiracy theory seems to be the thing that you're best known for.
Alas.
How is it that conspiracy theory intrigues you so much?
Well, it's like internet. It forces you to consider alternatives. Well, if you have a book by a conspiracy theorist and accept it as the holy writ, you can spend the rest of your life spreading that conspiracy theory and annoying everybody who doesn't believe it and pounding on the table. But by God, look at this document right here and all that stuff. But by and large, on internet, if you go into alt.conspiracy, you'll find 80 different conspiracy theories fighting it out among one another, and you're forced to start thinking, do any of these make any sense? Is there one that makes more sense than the others? Are some of them partly true, some of them mostly false? You got to start thinking in non-Aristotelian categories, not just quick true, false, but how much of this is true? Like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was a bestseller about 20 years ago. I was really shocked when a friend of mine said he found 3 things in it that weren't true, so he knew the whole book was a hoax. My attitude towards that book is like my attitude towards everything else. How much of it is true? Now, is it true? Is it all true? Is it all false? That seems like childish questions to me. The question is how much of it can be proven to be true and how much of it is just guesswork or bluff by the authors. It's about the Priory of Sion, an affinity group or conspiracy, whichever words you prefer, of French aristocrats and bankers. Such an organization does exist. Whether their explanation of what this organization is up to is true or false, that I think is debatable. But I think they prove the organization exists. And the Church of Mary Magdalene, which is a central part of their conspiracy, that exists. I've even spoken to somebody who's been there. I haven't been there myself yet, so that's hearsay, but still, he's a guy I trust.
So obviously there are things in the book that can be shown to be true.
Yeah, and there are some things in the book I think can be proven pretty clearly to be untrue. And then there's the large class that belongs in what von Neumann called the maybe state, in between true and false. You just don't have enough evidence to make a judgment.
So is that sort of the nut or the crux about conspiracy theory for you, is that it helps keep the mind open?
First of all, I think a lot of conspiracies do go on. I agree with historian Carl Oglesby, a multitude of conspiracies contend in the night. I think it's normal mammalian behavior. On the other hand, conspiracy buffs tend to be somewhere between mildly paranoid and full-blown clinical paranoid, and I don't trust many of them very much. I think the only conspiracy theorists I really take seriously are Buckminster Fuller, Noam Chomsky, and Carl Oglesby, and all the rest of them seem in varying degrees of paranoia.
But you don't feel that the whole field is just simply paranoid fantasy?
Absolutely not. The idea that conspiracies don't occur is like saying snow never happens. It's contradicted by all the facts of history. You pick up any book of history and you find they're talking about conspiracies in ancient Rome, conspiracies in Renaissance Italy, conspiracies within the British government in the Elizabethan age, History is largely a history of conspiracies. To claim conspiracies don't exist is, it's an article of faith, like the Darwinian idea that there's no intelligence anywhere and everything happened by accident. Or the Christian idea that a guy named Yahweh built the whole universe while living on a cloud a few miles above Israel and sending fire and brimstone down on everybody who infuriated him, or seriously vexed him, I should say.
You distinguish between fungible and non-fungible in relationship to conspiracy theory. Can you explain those terms?
Fungible is a legal term. It's related to the RICO law. Well, it originally started in mercantile law. A product is fungible if every part of it is the same. Like if you're selling corn and it's 90% corn and 10% junk you found in the backyard, it's non-fungible. Gold brick, it looks like it's solid gold, but it's mostly lead. That was a very popular swindle in the 19th century. The theory of fungibility, as I apply it to conspiracy theories, is when people go really bonkers and they say every member of the group is equally evil and they're all involved in the conspiracy and you can't trust any of them, etc. That's the kind of thing that Adolf Hitler taught. And I think those theories are always crazy, whether they pick on the Jews or the Jesuits or the Freemasons or whoever they pick out. I don't believe in fungible conspiracies. There are degrees of involvement. Is he witting? That's a question they use a lot in the CIA. That means how much does he know about what he's doing? Another useful term to remember is useful idiot. I think that started in British intelligence. A useful idiot is somebody who's working for an intelligence agency but doesn't know it. The theories I find really dangerous are like anti-Semitism, which led to unprecedented horrors in this century, and horrors on lesser scales because they had lesser technology throughout the history of Christendom. And I find a lot of feminism to be equally nefarious in implication, although they haven't had enough power to do anything about it. But some of the feminists, when they talk about men, they sound just like Adolf Hitler talking about Jews. It's really scary. The parallel is so damn close. And then there are these theories where all the Freemasons in the world are part of one gigantic conspiracy for the Freemasons to take over everything and run everything. I know too many Freemasons to take that seriously. Freemasons are as miscellaneous a group as the Presbyterians, the plumbers. You find all sorts of people in the Freemasons, and they don't all have the same ideas.
So the way you use the term, it means a kind of absolute blanket generalization about any group.
It's treating a group as homogeneous. Homogeneous would be a good synonym for fungible.
So you feel we can throw those conspiracies out just based on their fungibility?
On the face of it, everybody has different fingerprints. There are no two brains that are alike. So the idea that you can make generalizations about a large and miscellaneous group and they'll be true about every member of that group, that I think is the most nefarious form of stupidity on the planet.
Well, what's so interesting with that particular form of conspiracy theory is that it contains what you call a strange loop.
Oh yeah, when you say Bertrand Russell looked into the evidence and concluded that the bankers of Europe consisted 90% of Gentiles and only 10% of Jews. So the Jewish bankers conspiracy is a myth, and they'll come back with Bertrand Russell was Jewish himself. He changed his name. Then you got to try to prove that Bertrand Russell wasn't Jewish. You know? I actually got into that argument once with somebody about Hugh Hefner. They were convinced he was Jewish. All pornography is created by Jews. Hefner is a pornographer, therefore Hefner is Jewish. I told him he's a Presbyterian. No, he changed his name. Sartre is the only one who's ever commented on this. The delight in being stupid. If you make up your mind you're going to defend a really stupid position, you can get every intelligent person in the room hopping mad. No matter how rational they think they are, they'll eventually they'll get more emotional than you are if you just keep repeating the same stupid thing. This is in an essay he wrote called The Anti-Semite and the Jew. And if you're not Jewish and you try to argue with an anti-Semite about his prejudices, the next thing you know, you are yelling and shouting and acting like a fanatic more than he is, because he's saying so many stupid things like You must be Jewish yourself. No. How about you? Well, then your wife is Jewish and she's corrupted. No, my wife isn't Jewish either. Well, then it was your grandfather. And, when you get into this infinite regress like that, eventually you lose your temper, and then you feel you're as dumb as the guy you're arguing with. Oliver Wendell Holmes called that the hydrostatic principle of controversy. The fools drag everybody down to their own level. Well, Sartre noticed this particularly in anti-Semites. But I've noticed it in all sorts of dogmatic people, that whole strain, like the flat earthers. You get into an argument with a flat earther, and I guarantee you lose your temper before he loses his, because he's enjoying being stupid. He's enjoying making you angry just by sticking to a position which he knows nobody else can believe. That also gives you a feeling of belonging to the elite. Everybody else is too stupid to see the truth, but I belong to the small group that knows the truth. After you believe that, you're ready when the leader says, here's your cyanide Kool-Aid, have a drink. You, oh yeah, sure. And you swallow it all down.
Do you believe that most conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorists are working from a basis of a rational and logical will to determine the facts of a situation? Is it scientific, or is this completely some kind of emotional?
Well, it covers the gamut. I like to think of things on a scale of 1 to 10. And I would say some conspiracy theories on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is sanity and 10 is total raving lunacy, certifiably insane, as they say. I would say most conspiracy theorists are somewhere above 5 on that scale, and a lot of them have reached 10. But there are some that are pretty close to 1, like Carl Oglesby and a couple of other offbeat historians, Noam Chomsky, Buckminster Fuller, and me. Like I said, everything is under control. Conspiracy theories help make sense out of what otherwise seems a senseless world. That's why so many people believe them, including me sometimes.
How much do you think our own government operates on the basis of conspiracy theory?
Well, I think they worry about conspiracies more than most conspiracy buffs do. I think the government is full of people with guilty consciences, and they're constantly worried we're going to find out what they're really up to. And so they hire more and more spies to spy on us, to find out what we're doing and saying, to see if we're getting to be a real menace to them. And of course, that means they need more spies to spy on their spies, in case some of their spies are double agents, which is well known in the whole espionage business. So then they need a third order of spies to spy on the second order of spies, and eventually you end up with somebody like J. Edgar Hoover, who uses his power to blackmail the presidents of the United States. Stalin murdered 3 chiefs of the secret police in a row because they found out too much about his own secrets. And nobody murdered J. Edgar Hoover, at least I don't think so. I think he died of natural causes. But he was blackmailing presidents from Roosevelt on. He blackmailed every president who wanted to do something Hoover didn't approve. Like Nixon said in one of the Watergate tapes, well, Hoover performed. He would have scared hell out of them. He's got a file on everybody. He just sensed the envy in Nixon. He wanted a file on everybody too. He was a rank amateur. Hoover had been at it for 50 years by then. And a lot of the files disappeared the day he died, by the way. Nobody will admit they know what happened to them. Somebody has those files and is still blackmailing people. The government is more afraid of us than we are of them. That's what I always emphasize when I'm talking to radical groups who think their phones are tapped. Well, of course your phone is tapped. If you've done anything to annoy the government, your phone is tapped. They've probably got a mail cover on you, too. But that just shows they're more afraid of you than you are of them. The government doesn't trust the people. And then they wonder why the people don't trust the government. Well, the people don't trust the government because they know we're being spied on all the time. At the last count I heard, there were over 200,000 lawyers working for the federal government. And you know how much harm a single lawyer can do? A single lawyer can ruin your whole life, just one day in court. 200,000 lawyers devising modifications and amendments to laws and working for Congress and changing, the bureaucracy, the Kafkaesque world they have created is so onerous, obnoxious, and unbearable to most of the citizenry that everybody bitches about the government at least part of the time. Ergo, the government knows they are not well loved, and they're wondering how many of us are joining militias or forming revolutionary communist parties like those nuts down in the South, or doing something else subversive to overthrow. So they got to keep spying on us to make sure we're not getting too ornery. And the more the people discover the government is spying on them, the more they distrust the government.
So does that vicious circle end up going anywhere?
Well, it produces what I call rigidicus bureaucraticus, which is where all brain activity ceases. That's due to the Snafu principle.
What's the Snafu principle?
I was working for an engineering firm, and it was quite clear to me that what the engineers wanted to do and what management wanted to do were two different things, and management never listened to the engineers because they thought they all really wanted to be physicists, and they settled for being engineers because they didn't have enough money to go through postgraduate work and so on. But they really want to go to the moon and do all sorts of impossible things. And we're here to see that they do things that make money. Whereas the engineer's attitude is those people are only bean counters, and they don't realize how much more money they can make if they let us do the creative things we're thinking about. But the engineers could never get that through because the management was above the engineers. And so the engineers knew what management was thinking, but management didn't know what the engineers were thinking. And then I happened to read Kropotkin's Mutual Aid as a Factor in Evolution, in which he talked about how he became an anarchist. Kropotkin was a prince of the Romanov family, related to the Romanov family.
To the Tsar, in fact.
Yeah, related to the Tsar, yeah. And he was an amateur scientist, and he made a lot of important discoveries in geology and related sciences. He was sent to do some surveying work in Siberia. He discovered all the laws passed in Moscow for commerce on the rivers were being broken every day because the people who did the commerce on the rivers had discovered that they tried to obey the laws, they couldn't do any business at all. The laws were so complex, intricate, Baroque, and Tsarist in general that you just couldn't obey them. They clogged the system. Nothing could be done. So people just casually disregarded the laws and went about doing their business. And Kropotkin thought that over for a long time and decided that's the way it is in hierarchical organizations. When the people involved in a process aren't making their own game rules, when somebody 1,000 miles away is making the game rules, things are going to be all screwed up unless the people just are far enough away that the guy making the rules can't find out they're not following the rules. If we had a primitive communication system in America today like they had in Russia in Kropotkin's day, everybody in California who needed medical marijuana would be using it, and Clinton wouldn't have found out about it and sent the feds in to start throwing them in jail. The only way any system survives is if the people who are in the actual situations can make their own rules, and somebody, bureaucrats 1,000 miles away, don't know anything about it. And this leads to what I call the burden of nescience. If you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, anything you sense, smell, hear, see, intuit, feel, anything that registers on your nervous system can be reported to those above you only if it suits their prejudices. If it doesn't suit their prejudices, you shouldn't report it to them because A, they may order a court-martial if you're in the Army, they may write a pink slip if you're working for a corporation, or they may put you on trial for treason if you really annoyed them, or if you live in a Catholic country, you might get called up before the Inquisition and burned at the stake, etc. So as you go up the hierarchy, there's more and more facts that cannot be reported to the next highest level. So at the very top of the pyramid, there's the people who have all the power and don't know anything except what suits their prejudices, because nobody dares to tell them anything they don't want to hear. Meanwhile, those at the bottom of the pyramid have this burden of nescience where they're not supposed to know, think, feel, sense, or in any way make any decisions of their own. And they're the ones who are actually running all the machinery and the boats and the factories and everything. And I realized that's why the snafu was coined in the Army. The Army is the most rigidified form of this type of authoritarian structure. Nobody who makes any decisions knows anything about what's actually going on, where the decisions are being carried out, which is why the word snafu was coined in the Army. Situation normal, all fucked up. Well, that's the normal situation in any authoritarian pyramid, which is another reason why power corrupts. It's not just that power brings out the worst in people, but it's that when the higher you get, the less you find out about what you're actually supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be governing something, but you can't find out what it is that you're governing. There was an actual case in the Carter regime where a guy predicted when they were holding the hostages in Iran, there was this attempted rescue mission which got all botched up. There was one guy in the Carter administration who opposed that and said it couldn't work, and explained on military and technological grounds why it was going to be a fiasco. And then they tried it anyway, and it was a fiasco, and guess who got fired? He did. Jimmy Carter just couldn't stand having somebody on his staff who had been proven to be smarter than he was about just one issue, not about everything in general. Jimmy Carter was a pretty smart guy for a president, but just one issue. This guy who was right when Carter was wrong was more than Carter could stand, so he had to leave the government. And so more and more the people at the top don't know anything about what they're supposed to be controlling.
So you said that modern Americans don't trust the government almost at all. How well do they trust the media?
Well, according to an article in the Christian Science Monitor a couple of years ago, it's pretty much around the same level as distrust of the government. It's around 3 out of 4 Americans don't trust the corporate media anymore. And of course, nobody trusts internet, not even the people who use it. All we know about internet is that you get any opinion you want, and then you're going to have to research a lot of craziness before you find any accurate data. But that's all to the good, because that's the way the universe is constructed anyway. If it wasn't for Aristotle, perhaps we all would have grown up sane, realizing that we're always gambling and we're never sure of anything. And that would make us all a lot more tentative and a lot more careful, and we do a lot less stupid things. But Aristotle created this true-false dichotomy, and everybody immediately decided that what they want to believe is true and what the people they don't like want to believe is false, and we've been at war with each other ever since. How is that for a gross oversimplification? Well, I think it's partly true anyway. We're gambling all the time. Nobody has a guarantee that they have the truth.
Do you think that we're now drifting towards a situation that resembles something out of the art of Kafka or Orwell?
I think we've gone beyond Kafka and Orwell. Neither Kafka nor Orwell have ever invented anything like the piss police. That is so surrealistic. I would suspect Salvador Dali faked his death and took over the United States government if there wasn't so much evidence against that hypothesis. Imagine a country built on the idea of individual liberty, where you can't hold a job without giving a urine sample at random intervals under a constitution that prohibits random searches. You got to go before a magistrate and prove evidence you think that a crime has been committed and why you think so. A cop has to fill out a form and show what crime he thinks was committed, why he thinks this guy committed it, why he thinks evidence might be found in that place. That's the traditional constitutional system. We got random searches of our houses, random searches of our bladders, and people think this is a constitutional democracy. I say it's a czarist government, and anybody who can study history can see it has nothing in common with the U.S. Constitution and everything in common with the situation in 19th century Russia.
So back to conspiracy theory. What do you mean when you use the term conspiracy coincidence syndrome?
Actually, I forget where I first encountered that idea, but I was working for Playboy, and somebody submitted an article. I think I was the only editor who voted for publishing the article. And it was about this thing. This guy set out to investigate conspiracy theorists, and he investigated a variety of them. Those who thought the Rockefellers ran the government, those who thought the Air Force was engaged in a cover-up of the UFOs, and I forget what others, about 3 others. He found all of them had real incidents that they could demonstrate to his conviction that they weren't making it up, that they had been persecuted, which helped prove that their conspiracy theory must be true, or why would they be persecuted? And I began to think, well, I don't exactly believe in psychokinesis, but I do believe that we program what happens to us a lot more than we're consciously aware of. And it occurred to me that if people who believe widely conflicting conspiracy theories get equally persecuted, they're bringing the persecution down on themselves in some way they don't understand. And that led me into the whole concept of coincidence and synchronicity, and some of it is pretty damn weird. You can't explain it in any rational terms. Well, take Mae Brussell. Her daughter got killed in a car accident. She thought the CIA did that. Now, my attitude is so many kids get killed in car accidents that to immediately jump to the conclusion the CIA did it is kind of premature. And if the CIA wanted to shut Mae Brussell up, the obvious thing to do would be to kill her, not her daughter. But then you find things that are really weird, like Kerry Thornley, who believed he was brainwashed by the CIA and was part of the Kennedy assassination, but he couldn't remember all the details. He got held up in his own apartment by a guy who, after pistol whipping him and taking a stereo and a television and a few other things he carted away. He took Kerry's ID with him too. Now why did he steal Kerry Thornley's ID? Maybe that's another coincidence like Mae Brussels' daughter being hit by a car. And the more you look into it, the more mysterious it gets. John Lilly, Dr. John Lilly, who has a background in more sciences than just about anybody I can think of, he has coined the metaphor. He insists it's a metaphor because he doesn't want to be known as a nut. I also call it a metaphor because I still have some faint hope that I won't be known as a nut. Cosmic Coincidence Control Center, CCCC. It does seem like Cosmic Coincidence Control Center pays special attention to people who pay special attention to it. The more coincidences you look for, the more you find. And the more you look for coincidences, the more you find the really weird ones that seem like synchronicities. As for example, the 23 theme that runs through several of my books. I was giving a lecture in St. Louis. Guy came up after the lecture with his wife, chatted with me a bit and said, I know how your 23 gimmick works. I said, okay, tell me. He said, it's a neurological grid. You make your readers abnormally conscious of 23s and they ignore all the other numbers. And I said, congratulations, you found the great magician who makes the grass green. According to Zen Buddhism, you are now enlightened. And then after a while, we decided we have a friendly chat. We decided to go get a pizza. We went to this pizza place. They give you a number while you wait for your pizza. Of course, we got number 23. He said, how do you do it? And I said, thought you did it that time. I mean, when this kind of thing starts haunting you, you find out that any philosophy you can invent fails to account for it. Synchronicity isn't a theory at all. It's a word that Jung made up and pretended he had a theory to go with it, but in the scientific sense, there is no theory of synchronicity. It's just a label for a phenomenon that tends to occur when you're in depth analysis, Freudian or Jungian, when you do a lot of LSD, or if you do a lot of Oriental meditation, or if you practice Western Kabbalistic magic. And it happens to ordinary people too, but it happens much more likely if you belong to one of those 5 groups. If you belong to all 5 of those groups, the synchronicities accumulate so much that you start to think, to quote Aleister Crowley, the whole universe is an individual dealing of God with your personal soul.
So when one starts investigating conspiracies, suddenly, by the same principle, facts backing up the conspiracy seem to pop from the woodwork?
Oh, yeah. It's like the Law of Fives, created by Kerry Thornley before he started remembering or imagining his connection with the CIA and brainwashing programs and so on. The Law of Fives holds that everything in the universe is directly connected to the number 5. Sometimes I restate it as given enough ingenuity on the part of the interpreter, but usually I leave that out and leave it in Kerry's form and leave the reader to figure it out for himself. But take, for instance, 666, the number of the beast. How the hell is that connected to 5? Well, add it up. 666, it adds to 18. 18, 1 plus 8 equals 9. 9 is 3 squared. There you got your 3 and your 2. 3 plus 2 equals 5. You see how easy it is? That only took 3 steps.
So because the mind is searching for those kind of connections, it's putting them together wherever it can.
Yeah, I'd like to do a book sometime on great blunders by intelligent people, because when you start looking for something, you tend to find, this wouldn't be like Simon Newcomb, the great astronomer who wrote a mathematical proof that heavier-than-air flight was impossible and published it a day before the Wright brothers took off. I'm talking about people who found a pattern in nature and wrote several scientific articles and got it accepted by a large part of the scientific community before it was generally agreed that there was no such pattern. It was all just selective perception. This happens over and over. And if it happens to scientists, imagine how much more often it happens to artists.
Can you give us an example of 1 or 2 conspiracies that you actually think are probably true?
The Kennedy assassination. I've never been satisfied with the Warren Commission. None of the Kennedy assassination buffs have convinced me that they got the right explanation, but I do feel there was some fiddle-faddle going on there, especially in relation to the wounds. You can't read the report from Parkman General Hospital at Dallas and the report from Bethesda in Maryland that evening without seeing. The body was altered. The Parkman wounds, as described by them, seemed to fit what the doctors there thought it was. 2 shots from the front. The Bethesda wound seemed to fit the Warren Commission theory of 3 shots from the rear. And the body was altered. The wounds changed their size, they changed their location. I don't claim to know who did it or why or anything like that. That's where every Kennedy assassination buff loses me. After they knock holes in the official theory, then they give their own theory, which doesn't sound any more plausible than the official theory. I don't know what happened, but I think there was a lot of deception of the public going on at that time. One theory I have considered, which most conspiracy buffs don't like because it's too tame, maybe all that was going on was that Oswald, like quite a few other defectors, genuinely defected to Russia, let's say, as a hypothesis. We can make a more complicated one. He only pretended to defect and was working for the CIA all along. But let's say he genuinely defected. He got disillusioned. He wanted to get out of Russia. He went to the State Department. They said, we'll help you get out, but in return, you got to work for us and pretend you're working for the KGB when you go back to the States. And so he's working for the KGB and the CIA at the same time. This is very common in espionage. It goes on all the time, the double agent system. Licio Gelli was working for the Gestapo and the Communist Underground, both during the Second World War. In the 1970s, while he was running the Pay Due Gladio conspiracy out of Rome, he was being paid by both the CIA and the KGB. This is very common. So Oswald comes back, he's working for 2 intelligence agencies, and for one reason or another, he cracks up, he gets pissed off, whatever you want to say, he decides to commit an assassination, and he does it. Everybody's trying to cover up his connection with their agency, and so all the evidence gets twisted around to cover up the connection with their intelligence agency. And there was no conspiracy at all, except a conspiracy to conceal the fact that he was working for more than one intelligence agency. That's a minimalist Kennedy assassination conspiracy theory. I know a lot more dramatic ones than that, but they don't quite convince me. That one doesn't convince me either, but it's more plausible than most, I think.
What other cases can you come up with that you feel are probably true?
On the scale of 1 to 10, I would put around 9.5. The closest to the absolute truth in my system of thought, that the government of the United States and most other governments, quite a few other governments, are largely controlled by the rich. And the democratic elections do not change anything because you're offered always a choice between 2 people, or as I say these days, my latest terminology, 2 lying bastards, both of whom are in the bag to the same major corporation. So it doesn't matter which one of them you vote for, the major corporations are going to be running the government. Like I said, I give that a 9.5. Maybe somebody got elected without getting millions of dollars from the major corporations, but I haven't heard of it. Usually the third-party candidates who don't get contributions from the big corporations, they not only don't get on the major media, but the major media mentions them only in passing to say third parties never win. That's the only thing you ever hear about third parties on television. It's about the only thing you ever read in news. But third parties never win. That's not true. We've had several cases in American history where third parties emerged as the new second party. But they keep telling us third parties never win, and they don't let us hear what the third parties are saying because they want us to be stuck with not a choice but a dilemma, to quote John Anderson, between 2 guys who are both in the bag to the same major corporation. So whichever one we elect, the corporations will still be running the country.
Bob, how do you find that conspiracy theory is related to literature?
Well, I suppose most of the epics have a conspiracy theory in them. The Odyssey is all about Odysseus's attempts to get home and Poseidon's endless conspiracy to get him stuck on one island or another where he can't get home from. The Divine Comedy is all about Satan's conspiracy against God's plan. So is Paradise Lost. Conspiracy is a constant theme in Shakespeare. The history plays, the tragedies. It reaches the point in Hamlet where Hamlet has one of the shortest speeches in Shakespeare. Seeming. Nobody knows what's real anymore. There's so many conspiracies going on in Denmark, you know. And of course, conspiracy is very big in modern literature, even before Illuminatus. It's in all of Pynchon's novels. If you read them all, they're all different aspects of the same gigantic conspiracy, which is never quite identified. Of course, Moby Dick can be regarded as a conspiracy theory. As Ahab says, be the white whale principal or the white whale agent, I will wreak my vengeance upon him. He's not sure that the white whale is the source of malice, or the white whale is just an agent of some supernatural source of malice. But in either case, the whale is the visible target. All visible things are but masks, as Ahab says. Now, there's a good motto for a conspiracy theorist. All visible things are but masks. That's for the more occult conspiracy theories.
Do you think it works the other way around, where conspiracy theory can contribute to or inform literature in some way?
Well, by the time you get to Hamlet, you've entered what Mary McCarthy very intelligently called epistemological tragedy. The whole problem of Hamlet is trying to find out what's real. Can you trust the ghost? Is he a goblin damned who is trying to lead Hamlet to his own destruction? Or is he really the ghost of Hamlet's father? Or is he just a hallucination because Hamlet is losing his mind? And then there's the more vital question raised by Oscar Wilde. Are the commentators on Hamlet really mad or only pretending to be mad? I think conspiracy theory is a very good training for thinking in non-absolute categories. Of course, most conspiracy theorists never get there. They think in absolute categories. They have the one true conspiracy theory. But if you study conspiracy theory from a sort of anthropological angle, which I sort of think is what I'm doing, at least that's the way I define it for myself, it's a great learning experience. You compare one conspiracy theory with another and see which ones are the nuttiest and which ones seem the most plausible. And you find the ones that seem most plausible have their nutty elements in them too. It's like urban folklore. It's like reading the Weekly World News. You run into these things that are so crackpot you can't believe that anybody could possibly have actually printed them and circulated them. Like Our Lady of the Flowers in Long Island, I forget where, one of those little cities in Long Island. There's this woman who channels the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she announced that the Vatican has been taken over by Satanists, and Archbishop Lefebvre should be the next pope, and that Jesus himself invented AIDS because he was so pissed off at the gay community. And because Jesus invented it, science will never find a cure for it. And I would love to see that with a cartoon of Jesus with one of those cute little white gowns they always have him wearing and a couple of test tubes, cackling like the mad scientist in an 80s movie. Say, this will kill off a few million of those goddamn fags.
Do you have any other favorite theories that you've heard recently?
Well, besides Lyndon LaRoche's theory that I am the head of the Illuminati, Lyndon has also contributed the absolutely wonderful, one of my all-time favorites of the field of nut theories. Queen Elizabeth personally sent Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley to the United States to corrupt us with Oriental religions and drugs.
What's the payoff for her? I'm just curious.
Then Britain will become the major power again after we've been destroyed by Oriental religions and drugs. And you can see we're being destroyed faster every day, right? You know, everybody says when they talk about religious tolerance, we're all equal, Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. And yet the curious thing is that there are more Buddhists in this country now than Jews. Protestants in first place, Catholics second, agnostics third, Buddhists fourth, Jews fifth, and then we got the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Mormons. But anyway, agnostics are pretty high up, and since I'm somewhere between an agnostic and a Buddhist, I'm somewhere between third and fourth place. I'm ahead of the Jews anyway. Oh yeah, then there's the Christians Awake in Birmingham, Alabama. They believe Ronald Reagan not only was not a real conservative, he was actually a gay Freemason. And he was the head of a gay Freemasonic conspiracy which was secretly engaged in filling the government with communist agents and pretending to oppose abortion while actually strengthening the power of the abortionists.
God, you know, it all makes sense now. One of the most popular, I guess you could call it conspiracy theories, and it's almost more like a whole genre of conspiracy theories recently, is the whole extraterrestrial phenomenon. I mean, it's reached almost unbelievable proportions. What do you think is behind all that?
It's been growing since the 1940s. The first UFO abductee was Bugs Bunny in a cartoon called Hasty Hare in 1948 or 9. And then human abductees began to appear. And then Bud Hopkins arrived on the scene with scientific hypnosis, or at least what he calls scientific hypnosis. And he found any place where he could find somebody who could remember being abducted by extraterrestrials, he could find 3 other people in the same neighborhood who had the same experience, if he put them under hypnosis often enough. And so it's been growing. There are so many variations on it, though. There are the extraterrestrial rapists. In a galaxy far, far away, they get into some really vicious neurochemicals every now and then. And they say, hey, let's get into the flying saucer and zoom across 10 galaxies and have another go at Whitley Strieber's ass. Then there's the Joe Simonton case. That's another of my favorites. He was a heavy drinker, which is one reason for doubting him. On the other hand, he never tried to capitalize on his experience or make any money out of it or go on radio shows. He called the Air Force and told them that a UFO landed in his backyard and some critters got out of it. I forget how he described them, and they asked him for some water. He brought out a bottle of water, and they handed him a plate of pancakes, took off with the water, and never came back. And when the Air Force investigated, he had these pancakes from outer space from somewhere. They actually took them to Wright-Patterson Air Force and analyzed them and found out they were very heavy in wheat germ, which indicates that whoever baked the pancakes was a health nut from outer space or from here. But what I love about this story is that Hynek, the guy who invented the swamp gas theory, he interviewed Simonton extensively and came away convinced that whatever happened, Simonton really believed in what he was saying. Does that mean he had too much to drink that day? I don't know. Jacques Vallée also interviewed Simonton and concluded he believed in what he was saying. That leads me right into the Jungian theory. Carl Jung believed the UFOs were an eruption of archetypes from the collective unconscious. And Jung never did make that too clear, but I think he attributed it to the Cold War. He felt we were living in times of such tension that the whole collective psyche had to change. And according to Jungian theory, for that to happen, there's got to be a lot of archetypes escaping from the collective unconscious. And in fact, a lot of extraterrestrial stories have a lot in common with traditional themes like the fairy folk of France and the British Isles and the demons, especially the sex monsters from outer space, the rapists from outer space. That's very similar to the incubi and succubi of the Middle Ages. Monks in the Middle Ages were frequently tormented by female demons who would have sex with them in their sleep, and they wouldn't know about it till they woke up having an orgasm. Monks were afflicted by this for hundreds of years. I don't know if it ever happened to any married men. It happened occasionally to nuns too. They were called succubi instead of incubi. It was male demons who were screwing the nuns. It's happening now all over the country. It's the same phenomenon. So do they come from hell or from outer space or from the collective unconscious? John Keel believes they come from what he calls ultra-terrestrials. He says they've always been around. They're not inside us or outside us. They don't relate to in or out the way we understand them, and we can't get rid of them, and they'll always plague us, and we'll never know what they are. Nobody likes John Keel. The Orthodox believers and the skeptics both hate his books. I find them refreshing and amusing.
So on your conspiracy theory scale of 1 to 10, let's start with at least just the existence of extraterrestrials that come to Earth.
I would put that above 5. No, not that come to Earth. I would put the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence above 5. But that's a personal gut thing as well as a scientific thing.
But you
the scientific evidence is very ambiguous. But it does seem, like Jodie Foster said in Contact, it seems like an awful waste of space if we're the only intelligent beings in it. And what Carl Sagan called billions and billions of galaxies, each of them with billions and billions of solar systems, And then it depends on how you define intelligence. The older I get and the more I study nature, trees, dogs, chipmunks, seagulls, dolphins, ants, the more I become convinced that intelligence is a multifaceted thing and human intelligence is only one type, and to think human intelligence is superior to all other forms of intelligence is sort of like the delusion that I'm the best-looking guy on the planet. You know, it's a kind of mass narcissism. So I see intelligence everywhere, so that's another reason for thinking it's not only on this planet, but scattered all over the universe. Whether it ever came here or not, I don't find the thought preposterous, but I don't see any conclusive evidence yet that we've been visited.
So of everything you've heard, you don't think any of it is?
Not conclusive. Some of it is more heavily suggestive than others. And I noticed the French government recently came out with a report taking the extraterrestrial hypothesis very seriously. I think it's the first time a government has taken that position. I don't reject the extraterrestrial theory, I just don't feel it's been proven yet.
You know, since your book about conspiracy theory called Everything is Under Control came out a few years ago, have any new theories come to light that you find particularly intriguing?
I more and more see the czarist element in this country, how it's taking over more and more aspects of American life. Now they're paying television shows to slip in government propaganda in the middle of alleged entertainment. That's a typical czarist tactic. I'm more and more convinced that when they selected a czar, they knew just what they were doing. I think the czarists have very largely taken over this country. We're living in a Dostoevsky novel. We're not in a Kafka novel, after all. We're in a Dostoevsky novel.
Something you've written about extensively, Bob, is the P2 conspiracy. Is that something that is still going on as far as you're concerned?
Well, I'd put that around 8 on the scale of probabilities. P2 in Italian, or P2 in English, it's short for Propaganda 2, which is named after Propaganda Uno, which was a socialist conspiracy within the Masonic movement of Italy in the 19th century. Propaganda 2 seems to have been a fascist conspiracy within the Freemasonic movement in Italy. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about Masons, and as far as I can figure out from all my research, such as it is, Casanova hit the nail on the head when he said there's nothing conspiratorial about Freemasonry, but many conspirators have joined Freemasonic Lodge and used them for conspiratorial purposes. That's what Jelly did when he got to the 3rd degree in the Grand Orient Lodge of Egyptian Freemasonry. He then formed P2, starting out with only those who had reached the 3rd degree, and then recruiting others, because part of the rules of P2, you had to make a full confession of all your sins and crimes to your master to show your absolute faith and solidity with the brotherhood of P2 or P2. And then Jelly used all that to blackmail other people to force them to join P2 or P2. And by the time the whole thing blew up, it turned out there were 950 members of the Italian government who belonged to P2, as well as most of the chief bankers, and Calvi and Vatican were just the principal ones. First of all, for the benefit of those not aware of P2 at all, around 1982, a whole bunch of people got indicted in Italy as part of this conspiracy. And what they were doing, among other things, they were doing bombings which were attributed to the Red Brigades. This was part of the CIA's Gladio project to turn Italian politics to the right. And so they were doing bombings and making the left wing look like a bunch of crazy bombers. They were also assassinating left-wing politicians, and they were laundering cocaine money from South Africa and heroin money from the Mideast through the Vatican Bank, the Banco Ambrosiano, the Franklin National Bank, run by Michele Sindona, and the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas, run by Roberto Calvi, who owned the Banco Ambrosiano. And the Cisalpine was owned by Calvi and Archbishop Marcinkus, who ran the Vatican Bank. And it seems the cocaine money from South America went through the World Finance Corporation in Miami, then it went to the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas, then it went to the Vatican Bank, which is the economic equivalent of a black hole. Anything that goes in there never comes out again. Bank examiners can't get in because, as I said, it's not on Italian soil. Well, in the course of the investigations, Roberto Calvi was found hanging from a bridge in London, And I've written about that in 3 or 4 books, and just lately somebody finally confessed that he did it. He was a mafia hitman, and of course he had no idea why he was killing Calvi. It's not polite to ask why. If you're a hitman, you're told who to kill and you go and kill him. You don't ask why. I think that's bad manners.
But
so we don't know why.
Hanging from a bridge?
Yeah, with his pockets stuffed with bricks. The first book on the Calvi mystery was called The Strange Death of God's Banker by Della Forte. He got the answer right at the very beginning. He said the mafia did it, and they put the bricks in Calvi's pockets to make it look like the Freemasons did it. Because the first degree initiation in Freemasonry, you swear that if you ever betray your brothers in the craft, may you be hanged where the rising tide covers your dead body with your pockets stuffed with bricks. And Calvi was hanged where the rising tide did cover his dead body before he was found. But it seems the mafia did it, but why they did it, nobody knows yet. Probably they suspected Calvi of shortchanging them on one of the dope deals, and probably they were right. Calvi was an interesting person. You can't find a single photograph of him with glasses, and yet he owned 4 pairs of glasses for 4 levels of sight. But every time he saw a photographer, he never had a pair of glasses on. That indicates a high degree of vanity, I would say. He never read much, but whenever literature was discussed, Calvi would always say the same thing. There's only one book you have to read, The Godfather. That's the only book that tells you how the world is actually run. And apparently he was right, or at least the world he lived in was run that way. Michele Sindona, who ran the Franklin National Bank, which was part of the drug laundromat used by the CIA and the Pay-Due and the Galen Apparat and this whole underworld drug espionage network. Michele Sindona was convicted in New York of 65 counts of stock and currency fraud and of faking his own kidnapping to evade trial. And then after that, he had about a 3 or 4 year battle not to be extradited to Italy when they went to put him on trial for murder. He was defended by Richard Nixon's law firm, which is quite interesting because he was a guest at one of Nixon's inaugurations, too. When he got back to Italy, he was convicted of murdering a bank examiner. And while he was awaiting trial on further charges of being involved in the so-called Red Brigade bombings, he died in his cell either of self-administered poison or a poison given him by somebody else. Some accounts claim he cried out, "They've poisoned me." Other accounts say he just fell over without saying anything. It's like the Calvi thing. There was an argument for a couple of decades whether that was suicide or murder. The day Calvi was strangled and hung from the bridge by the mafia, his secretary fell or jumped or was pushed out of the window of the Banco Ambrosiano main headquarters in Milan. And there's a lot of strange coincidences connected with Pay-Due. Licio Gelli, who's generally considered the brains behind, or at least the Italian side of it, the real brains was James Jesus Angleton back in Langtree, Virginia, counterintelligence. Angleton was the first one to own a paper shredder in Washington. He may have invented the paper shredder. He believed there was a Soviet mole in the CIA of a rank at least as high as his own. And every night before he went home, he shredded everything in his office so the Soviet mole couldn't go through his papers and find out what he was working on. Angleton was running Gladio from Langtree, but Gelli was in charge of the Italian phase of the operation, and Galen was running the German and Soviet section. The World Finance Corporation in Miami was indicted by the DA of Dade County for knowingly laundering drug money. The word knowingly is very important because everybody who's researched the subject has come to the conclusion that everybody in the banking business is laundering drug money these days. It's a question of whether they know they're doing it or they're doing it unwittingly. Chase Manhattan was involved in some of these things, but nobody could prove they knew they were dealing with drug money. Money travels back and forth between banks, and most of the time they have no idea of its ultimate source. That's why Calvi invented 200 totally non-existent banks to help launder his money, but they went through a lot of real banks, too. The DA found out that 8 officers of the World Finance Corporation were former CIA agents. Now, a former CIA agent means 2 things depending on how paranoid you are. If you have a naive, trusting mind, like 1/4 of the population still has, according to the statistics I quoted before, that 3/4 don't trust the government. If you trust the government, a former CIA agent means somebody who once worked for the CIA and now he's doing something else. If you read enough novels about the spy world, or enough true books like The Double Cross System in World War II, you find out that a former intelligence agent is usually still on the payroll, but he's being paid through a numbered bank account in Switzerland, and he's still working for them. But they want to make sure that if he gets caught, it can't be traced back to the agency he's working for. That's when they're doing really criminal activities. So the World Finance Corporation was run by 8 former CIA agents who were either gone into the drug business on their own or were working for the CIA after officially being severed, and were laundering all the cocaine money from South America, which then went to the Cisalpine Bank, owned by Archbishop Marcinkus and Roberto Calvi, then to the Vatican Bank, then to the Banco Ambrosiano, then through 200 ghost banks. Nobody knows where most of it landed. Although Angeli was busted in Switzerland, there was a warrant out for his arrest in Italy, but they couldn't arrest him because by the time they got to his house, he had left Italy, because the head of military intelligence was a member of P2 or P2A also, and he tipped Gelli off that they were coming to arrest him. So Gelli took a plane to Uruguay, and after a few months he crept back to Europe and tried to get some money out of one of those numbered Swiss bank accounts. The Swiss arrested him. They recognized him, and they put him in one of their top security prisons. Now, what I find fascinating about this, I've done a lot of travel in Europe. Everybody in Europe will tell you the Swiss have the most incorruptible police in the whole continent of Europe. Yet they only held Gelli for 48 hours. Within 48 hours, he was out of that maximum security prison and on another plane back to Uruguay, a mystery which has never been explained. When I was in Geneva, which is where the prison was, I suggested they should put over the door of the prison the 3 monkeys with the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and the motto, ficken Sie nicht mit pay due, which being translated in English is don't screw around with the Freemasons. No, don't screw around with the Italian Freemasons, anyway, not nowadays.
The Freemason connection is interesting because it's also there in sort of your theme conspiracy, which is the Illuminati.
After 30 years approximately of researching this, I have never found any reason to believe in a Freemasonic conspiracy. But I do believe that, as I quoted Casanova, Freemasonry, being a secret society, has been used for conspiratorial purposes at times, like the Gelli case and the Adam Weishaupt case, which so many right-wingers in this country have never forgotten. Adam Weishaupt died over 200 years ago. But he had a secret society within Freemasonry called the Illuminati, which seems to, as far as you can judge from the more reliable historians, was devoted to plotting to institute in Europe the kind of democracy that was instituted in this country by the Constitution. According to the right wing, it wasn't that simple. What he really wanted to do was establish a socialist dictatorship with himself as dictator. And after 200 years, it's pretty hard to get through all the controversy. Thomas Jefferson called Weishaupt an enthusiastic philanthropist. But that's misleading, because enthusiastic in the 18th century meant pretty much what bonkers means today, a half-crazy philanthropist. Adam Weishaupt formed the secret society within Freemasonry, which was almost certainly plotting to overthrow monarchy and institute democracy, and maybe socialism, maybe anarchism, some think, and was also very seriously devoted to overthrowing the Vatican.
And how far did he get with this?
Not very far as I can figure out, but a lot of right-wing conspiracy buffs believe the Illuminati took over the banking system of Europe and then took over the banking system of America, and they now run the whole world.
So it's so successful, they're still around.
Yeah, well, the way I look at it, if there was one group running the whole world, things would make more sense. I believe there's at least at minimum 2 conspiracies, and probably as many as 24 at any given time.
You know, it often seems that you're, in a way, satirizing the whole field of conspiracy theory.
Oh, very definitely, but I satirize everything. You know, William Burroughs was one of my favorite writers. In 2 of his books, he has a couplet up front without giving the source. And I met him so many times, I never remembered while talking to him to ask, did you write that yourself, or where did you get it from? The couplet is, lesser kings the name of party know. Where I come in, I kill both friend and foe. And I think that's the motto of every true satirist. You shouldn't play favorites. I satirize my own ideas as much as I satirize anybody else's ideas. I believe it's unsafe to be too sure of yourself, so every one of my books turns around and satirizes itself before it's over. After I get through demolishing everybody else's, I demolish my own.
Have you ever written a book that was fully self-satirical from beginning to end?
In some sense, they all are, but I can't think of one in particular.
So you're not picking on the conspiracy theorists in specific?
I think a lot of conspiracy theorists, besides the ones who think I'm a CIA disinformation agent, a lot of conspiracy theorists like my works. They just want to correct me on a few minor points that I haven't gotten right yet. I think I've been much harder on Christian fundamentalists than I've been on conspiracy theorists. And the funniest thing is, well, I wrote one book satirizing PSYCOP, the Committee for Non-Scientific Non-Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. Just one book out of all the books I've written. They still hate me for that, and they still think of me as their principal enemy. They are very sensitive, very, very defensive, and very paranoid. They have the biggest conspiracy theory of all, which is that almost all the scientific research on so-called psychic phenomenon for the last 100 years at thousands of universities all over the world, it's all a conspiracy of wishful thinkers who are deliberately distorting all their evidence. And they know this because they don't do any experiments themselves, so they can tell the truth without having to get messed up by confusing data like the psychic investigators do.
They just already know it's wrong.
Yeah, they know it's wrong, so they don't have to investigate. That is the most enormous and hilarious conspiracy theory around, especially if you start reading some of the classic papers on parapsychology, which none of them have ever read. You can tell from their writing. They never read The Enemy because that might corrupt them. You know?
What's the payoff for being a sort of one-sided conspiracy theorist?
Payoff is that you belong to the elite that knows the truth, and you feel superior to all the idiots who haven't figured it out yet. I think that's the real kick in the Jehovah's Witnesses. I once did an article about the Jehovah's Witnesses for a news magazine, and I went around with 2 Jehovah's Witnesses from door to door as they knocked on the door and tried to get in to sell their line. Most people slam the door in their face, but they're infinitely patient because they're doing the Lord's work. So I go to the next door, and 1 out of 6 will leave the door open for a little while and talk to them for a short time. About 1 out of 20 will let them in and seriously listen to their arguments. And I watched all this, and then afterwards we had lunch together. I did a whole morning with them, and I got asking them about some of their crazier doctrines, and I saw how much it meant to them that they wouldn't take blood transfusions for their children, and they'd rather let their children die. That seems monstrous and insane to most of us. But to them, that makes them superior to the rest of us because we're too dumb to see how evil blood transfusions are. They're better than us because they can see it and we can't. And that's why people believe a lot of crazy things. It makes them feel superior to the sane people who can't see it the way they see it. It's like Sartre again, the anti-Semite and the Jew. Anti-Semitism gives you a tremendous psychological advantage because almost everybody you meet disagrees with you and tries to straighten you out. And you can feel superior to them because you know the truth and they don't.
So a psychological power edge.
Yeah, well, it's also very close to what Leary said about emotional politics. The most emotional person in the room controls everybody else because you got to respond to their emotions one way or another. You know, if we had a third person in this room throwing a temper tantrum and denouncing us both as Satanists or communists or something like that, we couldn't ignore him. We'd have to deal with his emotional tantrum rather than an intelligent conversation. So the most irrational person in the room sort of dominates, especially if they're claiming that Martians are putting poison gas through the keyhole, you know.
Did the good Dr. Leary have any conspiracy theories?
Yeah, he believed there are 24 conspiracies wherever you go. He identified them at Harvard and found the same 24 in Folsom Prison, except that they spoke better English at Harvard, but it was still basically the same 24 genetic types.
So these are the 24 types from Neuropolitik?
That's right, yeah, the 24 types of nervous systems. People with the same imprints in their nervous systems tend to flock together and work for the same goals. And when I find that people with the same imprints as myself, we call it an affinity group, and we talk about how we're improving the world. When somebody we don't like does it, we call it a goddamn conspiracy. The real difference between a conspiracy and an affinity group, I mean, the objective difference is how much lying do you do and how much deception do you do. I don't care what you're conspiring to achieve. I don't care what the hell your goal is. If you're not lying and deceiving, I don't think it should be called a conspiracy.
Well, let's talk about that. What makes a conspiracy by definition?
Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by von Neumann and Morgenstern, they point out in poker, business, and war, the two basic laws are to get more accurate information than anybody else and to give as much inaccurate information as possible to everybody else. And you can see how that works in business. Private detectives who are always solving murders on television, in real life they spend most of their time stealing secrets from one corporation for another corporation to beat them and getting the product on the market sooner. That's what most private detectives work at. It's industrial espionage. They gotta know more than the competition, and in war, that's what intelligence is all about. An intelligence agency is trying to figure out what the enemy intelligence agency is trying to deceive them into believing and what's the real truth behind that, which is where the double-cross system comes in. A good deception system has what looks like a plausible story, which the opposition will never believe if they find out it came from you, and you don't want them to know it came from you. You want them to think it came from India or from Mars or somewhere else, but not from you. But if they figure out it came from you, they won't believe it. So you got behind on another story that looks even more like the truth. And once they pass through the first, they're likely to believe the second. And I think that's another facade, too. And in poker, you do it all the time. People are always trying to convince others they got a stronger hand than they have. Or sometimes if they got a really strong hand, they keep bidding low to keep the bidding going on. So the bidding will get higher and higher until it reaches the point where suddenly they put a really heavy bid. Everybody either folds or sees them, and since they got a really good hand, they rake in the pot. So the definition of a conspiracy is what von Neumann and Morgenstern call the basic laws of zero-sum games, which is make the other players believe things that aren't true and try to find out for yourself what really is true. And since everybody is playing the same game in poker and in business and in war, you're constantly being deceived. So that tends to produce paranoia in itself, doesn't it? That's why I'm reading a book right now called Non-Zero, which is based on the idea that we're evolving toward a non-zero-sum society on a global level. I'd like to see that happen. I think zero-sum games bring out the worst in people. Not only lying, but I was suspecting everybody else of lying. Well, as Henry Kissinger said, anybody in Washington who isn't paranoid must be crazy. I would say anybody in the modern world who isn't a little bit paranoid must be crazy. You're being lied to all the time. You're being manipulated and lied to and deceived by so many people who are professionals at it that I don't see how anybody can evade some degree of agnosticism. They may not be as agnostic as I am, but they've got to have some degree of agnosticism. It's been exposed over and over again how the CIA lied to President Johnson during Vietnam, how advertisers lie to us all the time. They put things on the ballots in California that have titles that are the exact opposite of what the law would do if the voters were dumb enough to vote for it. It's part of zero-sum games.
So a conspiracy is a group of people who are trying to do this on purpose.
Well, they're in a game. It happens to be a zero-sum game, and you win by either knowing more than your opposition or making sure your opposition knows a lot that isn't true.
But so by that definition, it's not necessarily illegal or secret. It's just...
But it always involves deception and spying. The way you find out is by spying. Like in poker, you constantly watch the other players' faces to see if something crosses their face that gives away the fact they have a better hand than they're acting like, or a worse hand than they're pretending to have.
Bob, would you like to leave listeners with any parting thoughts?
Amor et hilaritas, love and cheerfulness. And when you think of amor, think of Richard St. Victor's saying, Ibi amor ubi oculus est. Where there is love, there is correct vision. And when you think of hilaritas, or cheerfulness, think of Gemisto-Plathon. Gods can be recognized by their cheerfulness.
This concludes Session 4. Our program continues with